Ondine didn't know, waking up that morning, that it would be the last day she'd sleep under her own roof. She didn't know that the same wolves who had danced at her wedding a year before would lower their eyes the moment she needed them most. All she knew, standing before the mirror as she pinned the last strands of her hair, was that she missed her husband, the Alpha King Varek. He had left 11 days earlier for the Eastern Lands, summoned by an urgent request from an allied clan, a journey that should have lasted only a few days, and that, without her knowing it, concealed a trap woven by hands he trusted blindly. 11 days of silence. 11 days asking her own reflection whether the unease in her chest was instinct or simply too much fear fed by loneliness. She had no idea that, in just a few hours, she would be kneeling in the cold mud of the forest, cast out by her own people, condemned by a friend who had sworn loyalty to her husband before he'd even learned to walk. Finding an empty cabin at the edge of the territory, she would learn, alone, what it meant to start over from nothing. There, wolves who had lost their own packs began drawing near, pulled toward a woman who shared the little she had with those who had nothing at all. And she began feeding them, caring for them, waiting for a husband she refused to accept would never return. She had no idea that 7 winters would pass before hope was given back to her. 7 years after that fateful day, still kneeling in that same earth on a night like any other, 2 golden eyes would watch her from the darkness between the trees. And Ondine had no idea that gaze wasn't the end of everything she knew. It was only the beginning of everything still to come. If you love intense wolf stories filled with destiny, emotion, and unexpected twists, consider clicking the Super Thanks button below to support the channel. Your support helps us continue creating and sharing these stories with you. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories. And you? Leave a comment below with your name and the city you're watching from. The throne room had never felt so vast. Ondine felt the weight of every gaze before she even lifted her chin. The white stone columns that had witnessed her mating ceremony to Varek 1 year ago now seemed to lean over her like the walls of a cell. The pale blue gown she'd worn with such pride on that day was wrinkled now, dusted from the journey the guards had forced on her from the royal chambers to this hall, escorted like a prisoner instead of the Luna of this territory. She was only 23. Some mornings she still felt it, the gap between the crown on her head and the girl who'd grown up chasing her cousins through orchard rows. But she'd learned this past year how to fold that uncertainty away and let something steadier take its place. She did that now, square-shouldering the silence, refusing to let her hands shake where anyone could see. The council stood gathered in a half-circle before the empty throne. Empty, because Varek wasn't there to fill it. 11 days since he'd left for the Eastern Territories, a sealed letter, an ally clan's emblem, an urgent request for aid. 11 days of silence that Ondine had tried, and failed, not to turn into fear. And now, standing at the center of that silence, was Logan. He wore the royal colors that belonged to Varek. Logan had always been loyal to Varek, or so everyone believed. But Ondine had never forgotten the way he'd watched her on her wedding night, not with a friend's warmth, but as though she were a prize that, by some old and unspoken right, should have belonged to him instead. She'd told herself it was nothing, a trick of candlelight. She wasn't so sure anymore. "Where is my husband?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I want answers, Logan. Now." Something flickered across his face. Not guilt, she realized with a cold drop in her stomach, but calculation. Logan had been Varek's closest friend since boyhood, the brother he'd chosen back when they were just 2 young wolves running free through the woods, long before crowns and thrones. Ondine had trusted him the way she trusted her own mate. Now, looking into the flat coolness of his eyes, she didn't recognize him at all. "The Alpha King ran into trouble on his journey," Logan said, his voice carrying through the hall with an authority that wasn't his to claim. "Trouble from which, I'm sorry to say, he may not return." For half a heartbeat, something almost like satisfaction passed behind his eyes before he smoothed it away. there and gone so fast that Ondine could almost convince herself she'd imagined it. A murmur swept the room like wind through dry leaves. The floor seemed to tilt under Ondine's feet, but she didn't let the tears reach her eyes. Not here. That's not true. Then, louder. That is not true. My lady is understandably shaken. Logan stepped forward, his tone smooth, rehearsed. But this territory cannot wait for one woman's grief while it sits without leadership. The council convened last night and, with great regret, decided we must act before neighboring clans see our instability and try to take advantage of it. It was then that Ondine truly saw the elders around her, faces she'd known since childhood, neighbors who had eaten at her table, wolves who had danced at her wedding. Every one of them with their eyes lowered, unable to meet hers. She remembered, with a sick twist in her stomach, the private gatherings Logan had been holding these past weeks. Always with wine, always with quiet promises she'd chosen not to ask about. She was paying for that now. For the sake of stability, he went on, the council proposes that I assume the throne's responsibilities temporarily until the Alpha King's fate is confirmed. You can't do this. Ondine turned, searching for one face that still held loyalty. I am the Luna of this territory. Varric's bloodline runs through children we haven't had the chance to have yet. You all swore to protect that line. The silence that followed was the cruelest answer of all. Near the back, a thin, elderly voice broke through. She's right to ask it. It was old Marin, who had taught Ondine the names of healing herbs when she first arrived as a young bride, who had never once looked at her with anything but kindness. This council was not called to remove a Luna. I won't put my name to... You will sit down, Marin. Logan's voice cut sharp, final, and two of the younger council members flanked the old woman before she could finish. She sank back into her seat, her jaw tight, her eyes finding Ondine's for one brief, helpless moment, an apology she couldn't say aloud. Ondine's throat closed around the sight of it. There are those, said another voice, an elder Ondine barely recognized, who believe that a childless, grieving Luna will only bring weakness to this territory at the very moment we need strength. The words landed like stones. Heat climbed into Ondine's face, shame burning where pride had stood only moments before. She, who had danced in this same hall to the cheers of her people, was now being weighed and found wanting. We are not proposing harm to her, Logan added, almost gently, as if the words cost him something. Ancient law forbids spilling a Luna's blood inside these walls, a curse older than any of us would follow whoever broke it. And if, by some chance, the Alpha King still lives... He let the sentence hang, unfinished, his eyes never quite meeting hers. It would be unwise to give him cause for vengeance. No. For the good of all, we ask only that my lady leave the castle. There is a cabin in the northern woods near the forest line. She will have shelter there until matters are settled. You're casting me out. It wasn't a question. It was the shape of something her mind still refused to fully hold. No one answered, and the silence, once again, was answer enough. The guards who walked her to the gates were faces she knew, wolves who had sworn protection to the very family now turning her away like a stranger. None of them dared meet her eyes as they walked, and Ondine kept her chin high until the very last moment, refusing to let them see her tears, saving them for when she was alone, for when the sound of the gates closing behind her would be the only witness to her grief. It was only as she crossed the line where the forest began, leaving behind the towers of the home she had once called her own, that Ondine let her body finally give out. She dropped to her knees in the damp earth, fingers sinking into the cold mud, and let the sob she'd been holding since the throne room finally break loose. That was when she heard it. A howl, distant, rising from somewhere among the ancient trees. Not a sound of threat. Almost. And she doubted herself even as she thought it. A sound of recognition. She lifted her tear-streaked face and saw, between the dark trunks, two golden eyes watching her from the shadows. A gray wolf, lean, its coat ragged and uneven, standing a few yards off, neither advancing nor retreating. A shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold, a strange, bone-deep certainty that this was not chance. Only watching, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Ondine didn't know in that moment that this would be the first of many. She didn't know that this forest, which seemed to her now like the end of everything she'd ever known, was quietly holding the beginning of something no one in that throne room could ever have imagined. The first week in the cabin, Ondine cried so much she was fairly certain she'd dehydrate before she starved. By the second week, she'd run out of tears and started talking to the wolf instead. The gray one, the one with the golden eyes who'd watched her that first night, had taken to lying just outside the cabin door each evening, as though guarding something he hadn't decided was worth guarding yet. "You could at least pretend to be impressed by my fire building," she told him one evening, nursing a wobbly little flame that had taken her 4 attempts and most of her dignity to light. "Back at the castle, I had people for this." The wolf flicked an ear, unbothered, and went back to watching the trees. "Rude," Ondine muttered, and tossed him a strip of dried venison anyway. He caught it midair with an elegance that made her stale bread feel personally insulted. She named him Bram, mostly because he refused to answer to anything more dignified, and because shouting, "Hey, you," into a forest every evening had started to feel undignified for both of them. The seasons turned the way seasons do when no one's paying attention to them. Green to gold, gold to white, white to green again. The cabin stopped feeling like a tomb and started slowly, infuriatingly, to feel like hers. She learned which boards creaked and which ones lied about it. She learned to mend her own hem, badly, and to fish in the creek with more confidence than skill. She learned that wolves, as it turned out, had opinions, and Bram's opinion of her cooking was consistently, insultingly clear. More wolves came. A scarred old female Ondine called Hazel, who acted as though she owned the place and had simply allowed Ondine to live there. A pair of yearlings, reckless and ridiculous, who treated the cabin's single window as a sporting event entry point, until Ondine finally gave up boarding it shut. By the time real winter arrived, her second one in the woods, there were a dozen of them denning nearby, and Ondine had stopped sleeping with one eye open. She'd started, without quite noticing the moment it happened, sleeping like someone who had a family again. She still thought of Varric every single day. Some mornings the ache of it nearly buckled her knees before she even reached the well. The memory of his laugh, low and surprised, like he hadn't expected to be that happy, and was delighted to be wrong. She refused to let herself believe he was gone. No body had ever been found. No grave existed for her to grieve at. She held on to that the way Hazel held on to the best patch of sun by the cabin steps. Fiercely, and without apology to anyone. Back at the castle, life had taken on a very different texture. Logan sat upon a throne that did not fit him, in every sense that mattered. He'd had the royal tailor let out the shoulders of Varric's old formal coats, rather than have new ones made. A small vanity that fooled absolutely no one, least of all old Marin, who watched him from her seat at council with the particular, weary contempt of a woman who had once changed his diapers and was not about to forget it. "You're slouching, Your Almost Majesty," she said dryly during one session, not looking up from her needlework. "The crown doesn't sit right when you slouch." "I am not slouching, Marin. You're slouching the way a man slouches when he's stolen a chair too big for him." A ripple of badly suppressed laughter went through the younger council members before Logan silenced it with a look that wanted very much to be regal, and mostly succeeded in looking constipated. It would have almost been funny, Marin thought, if it weren't also slowly poisoning everything it touched. Trade had soured with 2 neighboring clans who didn't trust a throne occupied by a man with no true claim to it. The granary reports had started arriving late, and twice now, missing entirely. Whispers traveled the kitchens and the training yards alike. Not loud enough to call rebellion, not yet, but the kind of murmuring that builds slowly into something with teeth. Logan felt it too. even if he refused to name it. At night, alone in chambers too large for one man and entirely too full of someone else's portraits, he poured wine he didn't taste and told himself, over and over, that ambition justified itself once it succeeded. He simply needed time, stability. A wedding, perhaps, to a noble daughter who'd lend his claim the legitimacy blood alone hadn't given it. He did not let himself think about gray eyes and a wedding night 3 years past, about a longing that had curdled, slowly and completely, into something far uglier than love had ever been. He did not let himself think either about the letter that had arrived from the Eastern outpost 6 months ago, sealed, brief, and burned the moment he'd finished reading it. The prisoner still breathes. Your orders, my lord. 300 miles east, in a cell carved into the bones of a mountain, Varric had learned exactly 4 things in his years of captivity. 1. His captors were not particularly bright, which he found both insulting and useful. 2. The guard named Pell had a weakness for dice games and an even greater weakness for losing them. 3. The iron in his shackles had been forged with wolfsbane, just enough to keep him from shifting, never quite enough to keep him from hoping. 4. He was going to walk out of these mountains one day, and Logan was going to wish, with everything left in him, that he hadn't been quite so confident about leaving Varric alive. You're cheating, Pell accused, for the 3rd time that week, glaring at the dice in Varric's scarred hands. I'm chained to a wall, Pell. Explain to me how I'm cheating. I don't know. That's what makes it suspicious. Varric allowed himself the smallest smile, the kind he rationed carefully, the way a starving man rations bread, because smiling too often in a place like this felt like a betrayal of everything he'd lost. He'd been a king once. He still was, technically, though it had been years since anyone here had called him anything but prisoner, or, on Pell's more creative days, your royal nuisance. He thought of Undine constantly, not in the soft, distant way men think of memories gone faded, but sharp and present, the way you think of a wound that hasn't finished healing. He pictured her in the castle, surrounded by people who loved her, growing old in comfort and safety while he rotted here. It was, he told himself on his better days, the one thing he could be grateful for. Whatever had happened in the Eastern ambush, the false summons, the sudden closing trap, the years of silence since, at least it had happened to him, and not to her. He did not yet know how wrong that comfort was. You know, Pell said, scooping up the dice with the sullen dignity of a man who'd just lost his dinner ration. For a prisoner, you've got an awfully high opinion of yourself. I'm an alpha king. It comes with the territory. You're a half-starved alpha king in a hole in a mountain. The territory's gotten smaller. Temporarily, Varric said, and meant it with a conviction that surprised even him. That conviction sharpened into something else entirely 2 nights later, when a new guard rotation brought a young soldier careless enough to leave the cell block unsupervised for the length of a card game gone long. Varric had spent 3 years cataloging every loose stone, every worn hinge, every guard's schedule and habit and weakness, the way another man might catalog scripture. He had never had an opening. He had only ever had patience. Tonight, for the first time, he had both. The wolfsbane in his shackles had been dosed weaker these past months. A quiet cruelty from captors who'd grown lazy in their certainty that a man could be broken simply by being forgotten. They were wrong. Varric felt the old strength stir beneath his skin like a held breath finally released, felt his pulse slow and steady into something ancient and patient and furious all at once. He thought of Undine's laugh, of the particular stubborn tilt of her chin when she refused to let anyone see her cry, of 7 years stolen from a life that should have been theirs. The iron groaned. Somewhere above him, Pell was losing badly at dice and laughing about it, utterly unaware that the most dangerous prisoner in the Eastern Mountains had just stopped waiting. The escape, when it finally happened, was almost insultingly easy. Varek had spent 3 years preparing for impossible odds. Guards in formation, alarms ringing through stone corridors. A fight he'd have to win half-starved and outnumbered 10-1. What he got instead was Pell, slumped against the cell block wall, snoring through a wine headache after losing 11 copper coins he didn't have to a dice game he'd insisted, loudly and with great confidence, on rigging. "I want it on record," Varek murmured, working the weakened shackle free with fingers gone clumsy from disuse, "that you were a genuinely terrible guard, possibly the worst I've encountered, and I've had years to make comparisons." Pell did not stir. Somewhere in the deeper part of his wine-soaked sleep, he muttered something that sounded like a complaint about the dice, then rolled over and kept snoring. Varek almost felt bad leaving him to face what was coming. Almost. He paused at the cell door, looked back at the man who'd spent 3 years losing badly at cards and complaining about it, and found, to his own surprise, something close to fondness. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "you were terrible company. But you were honest, terrible company. That's rarer than you'd think." Then he was gone, moving through corridors he'd memorized stone by stone, past guard rotations he'd timed for longer than some of these men had been alive. The mountains beyond the prison were not kind to a man 3 years weakened, but they were, at least, his to walk freely for the first time in longer than he cared to count. He shifted the moment open air hit his face, and felt, for the first time since the ambush that had stolen his life out from under him, something close to whole. Wolf form came back to him like a language he'd never actually forgotten, just gone quiet from disuse. Every muscle remembering itself in a rush that nearly buckled his legs. He ran until his lungs burned and his sides shook, putting miles between himself and the mountain that had tried, patiently and methodically, to make him forget who he was. He did not get far before the first problem made itself unmistakably clear. He was alone. An alpha king without a bonded pack was not, technically, powerless. But he was something close to it, and the absence sat in his chest like a held breath he couldn't release. No bonded wolves to call on in the dark. No shared strength to draw from when his own ran thin. No answering howl that would summon help if the wilderness between him and home turned hostile. 3 days in, it promptly did. The storm came fast off the eastern ridges, the kind that turned gentle rivers into arguments and familiar forests into mazes that seemed to rearrange themselves out of spite. Varek spent a miserable night wedged beneath a rock overhang, human again because his wolf form's coat was, infuriatingly, no match for the cold, eating a fistful of half-frozen berries and seriously reconsidering every life choice that had led him to this particular ledge. "This is humbling," he informed a passing fox, who looked at him with the specific disdain of a wild animal watching a king eat berries off the ground, and did not care even slightly. It took him 4 months to cross the first range. 4 months of stolen food and longer stretches of no food at all, of trading labor at remote farmsteads for a meal and a dry roof, of slowly, painfully relearning how to be a person again instead of a story. Prisoners whispered to each other to make the nights pass faster. He grew leaner, harder, quieter than he'd ever been as a young king flush with confidence and a new crown. He grew a beard he loathed on sight, and a limp from a fall down a ravine he refused to examine too closely, mostly because examining it would require admitting how close it had come to ending everything. And every single night, without fail, lying under whatever roof or rock or open sky he'd found, he thought about gray eyes and a laugh he was increasingly terrified he was starting to misremember. The exact pitch of it, the way her nose wrinkled right before it came out. He'd lie awake reconstructing it like a man rebuilding a house from memory of its ashes, terrified of getting a single detail wrong. He did not yet know how close he'd come, more than once, to dying somewhere a search party would never have thought to look for a king who, as far as the world knew, no longer existed. Back in the territory's capital, Logan's reign had developed the particular flavor of a roof that hadn't quite caved in yet. but everyone underneath it had started eyeing the rafters with increasing suspicion. "The Eastern Outpost reports the prisoner is missing," Marin announced at council one gray morning, with the flat, undisguised satisfaction of a woman delivering very bad news to a man she had disliked since he was old enough to track mud across her clean floors. Logan's wine goblet paused halfway to his mouth. "Missing how?" "Missing as in not where he was supposed to be, which I'm reliably told is the customary definition of the word." Marin resumed her needlework without so much as glancing up. "Apparently, a guard named Pell lost rather spectacularly at dice the night it happened. I understand he's been demoted to latrine duty for his trouble. Some at court are calling that fitting. I am inclined to agree, though I admit my standards for justice have grown modest these past years." A few of the younger council members coughed unconvincingly to disguise laughter. Logan did not find any part of it amusing. "Find him," he said, low and tight, knuckles whitening around the goblet's stem. "Quietly. I want no rumors reaching the territory before I've decided what to do with them." "And if the rumors are simply true, my lord?" Marin's needle didn't pause, her voice mild as milk. "Some things have a way of finding their feet regardless of how quietly you'd prefer they walk. Truth is a stubborn houseguest. It rarely leaves simply because it's been asked to." Logan said nothing, but that night, alone again in chambers too large for one man and far too full of portraits belonging to someone else. With wine he poured out of habit and didn't taste, he found himself staring at the door as though Varric might simply walk through it, and felt, for the first time in years, something uncomfortably, inconveniently close to fear. By the time the fourth winter in the cabin arrived, Undine had stopped counting the days and started counting the wolves instead, which, admittedly, was a strange kind of calendar, but it was hers, and it suited her better than the careful court schedules she'd once kept. There were 19 now. Hazel still ruled the patch of sun by the cabin steps, with the unbothered tyranny of an empress who'd never once questioned her own authority. The reckless yearlings from that first winter had grown into reckless adults who'd recently acquired reckless pups of their own, 3 of whom had taken to using Undine's left boot as a chew toy despite her repeated, increasingly creative protests. "This is the only pair I own," she informed the smallest pup, a scrappy gray thing with her grandfather Bram's exact golden eyes, who gazed up at her with an expression of total innocence before trotting off with the boot anyway, tail high, clearly delighted with herself. "Bram, control your grandchild." Bram, lying in his customary spot just outside the door, flicked an ear in the universal wolf gesture for not my problem and went back to dozing. "Some alpha you turned out to be," Undine muttered, hopping after the pup on one bare foot, laughing despite herself in a way that, 4 years ago, she would have sworn she'd never laugh again. She'd built a second room onto the cabin that spring, with help she'd never expected to find this deep in the woods. Old Garrick, a hermit trapper who lived 2 ridges over and had wandered into her clearing initially looking for someone new to complain to about his knees, and had simply stayed, on and off, because, in his own words, "You're terrible company, but you make a decent stew, and I'm old, I don't have the years left to go shopping for better company elsewhere." "You say the sweetest things," Undine told him, handing over a bowl of the stew in question. "I'm aware. It's a gift I was born with, wasted on a man who lives alone in the woods, but there you are." Garrick brought salt and needles and a healthy supply of village gossip twice a season, most of it wildly exaggerated, and all of it welcome. In exchange, Undine fed him, mended the holes in his coat that he swore, every single time, he hadn't noticed were there, and tolerated his unsolicited opinions on everything from her fire building, which remained, after 4 years, genuinely terrible, to her chances of ever seeing her husband again. A subject he refused, stubbornly, gruffly, to let her give up on, even on the rare nights when some small, exhausted part of her nearly did. "You've got a whole pack now," he said one evening. watching the wolves settle in around the cabin for the night, a living, breathing wall between Undine and the rest of the world. Strangest thing I've seen in 60 years of living in these woods. Wolves don't den up with humans. Not like this. Not ever. They're not really just wolves, Undine said slowly, turning the thought over for what felt like the first time, though she realized, with a small jolt, that some quiet part of her had known it for a while now without putting words to it. Not anymore. Not only wolves anyway. Because something had changed, somewhere in those long, quiet years. Something she couldn't fully name but could feel, unmistakably, humming beneath her skin. She felt it in the way Bram's mood bled faintly into her own on the hardest days, a steadying warmth when her own courage ran thin. She felt it in the way the pups seemed to sense her sadness before she did, pressing their small bodies against her legs in silent comfort. She felt it most strangely of all, in the nights she woke with absolute baseless certainty that something far away was thinking of her too, a tug behind her ribs, faint as a held breath, that she'd long since stopped trying to explain away as imagination. She didn't have a word for it yet. She would eventually. For now, she simply pressed her palm against Bram's broad gray head, felt the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her fingers, and let herself hope. Fiercely. Stubbornly. The way she'd been hoping for 4 relentless years. That wherever Varric was, whatever was left of him, he was still thinking of gray eyes, too. 3 valleys away, half frozen and limping and entirely too stubborn to stop moving, Varric caught a scent on the wind that made him go very, very still. He didn't recognize it. Not exactly. It was nothing he could name, nothing his mind could pin down to a place or a face. But something in his chest, something old and bonded and long since gone silent, had just, impossibly, begun to hum. He lifted his head into the wind, golden eyes narrowing toward the west, and for the first time in 4 years, Varric allowed himself to believe, not hope, not wish, but believe, that he was, finally, walking in the right direction. By the time Varric crested the last ridge above the valley, he'd convinced himself several dozen times over that he was imagining things. The scent on the wind had grown stronger with every mile west. Not a single thread now, but a whole tapestry of them. Dozens of wolves, their presence woven so tightly together it felt less like a wild pack and more like a single creature with many bodies. He'd never heard of anything like it. He'd spent his whole life among bonded packs, had led one himself once, before it had been stripped away in an ambush that still visited him in dreams. This was different. This was deeper. And underneath all of it, fainter than the rest but unmistakable once he'd caught it, was something that made his chest ache in a way 4 years of captivity never had. Her. He told himself it couldn't be. He told himself grief did strange things to a starving mind, that he was simply smelling wildflowers and homesickness, and calling it a name he hadn't let himself say aloud in years. He told himself this right up until the moment he stumbled, half collapsing, out of the tree line and saw smoke rising from a cabin chimney in a clearing he didn't recognize. And a gray wolf standing utterly still at the edge of it. Golden eyes locked on him like the rest of the world had simply stopped existing. Bram did not growl. Bram did not advance. Bram threw back his head and let out a howl so loud, so layered with every wolf denned in that valley answering in turn, that the whole forest seemed to shudder with it. The cabin door flew open. Varric would later have absolutely no memory of crossing that clearing. One moment he was standing at the tree line, swaying on legs that had carried him 400 miles on stubbornness and berries. The next, Undine was 3 feet away, frozen on the threshold, a kitchen knife still loosely gripped in one hand from whatever she'd been cutting, staring at him like he was a ghost she didn't dare blink in case he vanished. "You're—" she started, and her voice cracked clean in half. "Filthy," he finished for her, because 4 years of practiced humor was apparently the only thing standing between him and falling apart entirely. Limping, possibly growing some sort of beard situation I haven't fully come to terms with. But yes, alive. The knife hit the dirt. She crossed the remaining distance at a dead run and threw herself at him with enough force that he genuinely staggered. And then her arms were around his neck, and his face was buried in her hair, and neither one of them was being remotely dignified about the sobbing, which frankly seemed fair after 4 years. "I knew it," she kept saying into his shoulder. Half laugh, half sob. "I knew it. I knew it. Maren can choke on her doubts. I knew you weren't." "You smell like wood smoke and wet dog," he murmured against her hair, voice rough. "You smell like a dead badger that's been wearing the same shirt since the Logan administration began." That is unfortunately accurate. From the doorway, Garrick, who'd wandered over that afternoon for stew and gossip and had gotten significantly more than he'd bargained for, cleared his throat loudly enough to be heard over 19 wolves who had all, without exception, started circling the reunited pair in a state of what could only be described as delighted chaos. "I'm going to assume," he said to no one in particular, "that this fellow is the husband." "This fellow," Undine said, pulling back just far enough to actually look at Varric properly, gaunt, scarred, bearded, limping, and somehow still, impossibly, looking at her like she was the only solid thing left in the world. "Is the husband." "Good." Garrick nodded slowly, already turning back toward the stew pot. "I'll put another bowl on. Man looks like he hasn't had a proper meal since the last rain." Varric's legs chose that precise moment to stop cooperating, the long miles and longer years finally catching up to him all at once, and he went down hard enough that Undine barely caught his weight in time, lowering him gently into the dirt, while the wolves crowded close, whining, pressing their bodies against him like they already, instinctively, knew exactly what he was. "He's burning up," Undine said, pressing a hand to his forehead, fear sharpening her voice. "Garrick!" "Already moving," the old man called back, hauling water toward the fire. Varric caught her wrist before she could pull away, holding on with what little strength he had left. "Don't let go," he rasped. 4 years of not letting go. "I'm not stopping now because of a fever." "You absolutely are," she said, voice thick, pressing a kiss to his knuckles even as she hauled him toward the cabin with Bram's help shouldering in on his other side. An entire pack rearranging itself wordlessly to carry their king the last few feet home. "But I'm not going anywhere. I promise you that." The fever held him for 6 days. Undine barely left his side for any of them, alternating between forcing broth past his cracked lips, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, and threatening, in increasingly creative terms, to personally drag him back from death if he so much as thought about leaving her alone with 19 wolves and Garrick's unsolicited opinions for a second time. "You don't get to do this," she informed him on the 3rd night, gripping his hand so tightly her knuckles ached. "You survived 4 years in a mountain prison, walked 400 miles on berries and spite, and you are not allowed to die of a fever in my cabin. It would be deeply embarrassing for both of us." He didn't answer. But his fingers tightened, just slightly, around hers, and she chose to take that as agreement. He broke the fever on the 7th morning, waking thinner and weaker than she'd ever seen him, but unmistakably, gloriously present, blinking up at a ceiling he didn't recognize with the particular confusion of a man who'd genuinely expected, somewhere in those 6 days, not to wake up at all. "Did I miss anything?" he rasped. "Or did the kingdom remain exactly as badly run as I left it?" "Worse, if anything," Undine said, half laughing, half crying as she pressed her forehead to his. "Logan's been letting out Theron's old coats instead of having new ones made. Maren says he sits on the throne like a man who stole a chair too big for him." "Maren," Varric said weakly, "remains the only sensible person in that entire castle. Remind me to give her a title when I get the throne back. Something with real authority, possibly mine." It took 2 more weeks before he could stand without his legs shaking. and 2 more after that before he could walk the clearing without Bram hovering at his side like an anxious, oversized shadow. In that time, something settled between them that Undine hadn't dared imagine she'd get back. Long evenings by the fire trading 4 years of stories, his hand finding hers without either of them quite deciding to let it, the easy, dangerous comfort of falling back into love with someone she'd never actually stopped loving in the first place. "They're bonded to me," Varric said one evening, watching the wolves settle in around the cabin in their nightly ritual, wonder plain on his face. "Not just loyal, bonded. I've never seen anything like it. A Luna binding an entire wild pack without ever shifting herself." "I didn't do it on purpose," Undine admitted. "I just fed them, talked to them. Treated them like they mattered, I suppose, the way no one back at court bothered to treat me those last few months." "Then you built yourself a kingdom out of grief and stubbornness," Varric said softly, "while I built myself nothing but scars. I think you got the better deal." It was Garrick, arriving 3 days later with salt and supplies and his usual surplus of opinions, who brought the news that shattered the fragile peace they'd been carefully building. "Village is talking," he said grimly, dropping his pack by the door without his usual ceremony. "Words reached the capital that someone's been spotted matching your description 3 valleys east. Logan's sent riders. Quiet ones. Asking careful questions in every tavern between here and the mountains." Varric went very still. How many riders? Enough to worry about. Garrick's weathered face was uncharacteristically serious. And there's worse. They've doubled the watch on the roads leading toward this valley specifically, like someone already suspects exactly where you'd run to. Undine felt the warmth drain out of the evening in an instant, replaced by something cold and familiar. The same dread she'd carried out of that throne room 4 years ago, returning now with a vengeance she'd hoped, foolishly, she'd left behind in the past. "He knows," she said quietly. "Or he's about to." Varric's jaw tightened, gold eyes hardening into something Undine hadn't seen in him before. Not the gentle, exhausted man who'd collapsed in her arms 3 weeks ago, but a king remembering, all at once, exactly what had been stolen from him. "Then we stop waiting for him to find us," he said. "We make sure that when he does, he finds an army he never saw coming." They had 11 days before the riders reached the valley, by Garrick's careful estimate, and Varric spent every single one of them turning the cabin clearing into something between a war council and the strangest training ground the territory had ever seen. "Right," he announced on the first morning, addressing 19 wolves with the gravity of a man briefing seasoned soldiers. "I realize most of you have never taken orders from anyone but each other, and I respect that enormously. But we're about to attempt something difficult, and I need you functioning as a unit, not simply a very large, very judgmental audience." Bram yawned, pointedly, and put his head back down on his paws. "Wonderful start," Varric muttered. "They listen to me," Undine offered from the cabin steps, biting back a laugh she didn't quite manage to hide. "Try asking nicely. Possibly with Bacon. They respect Bacon far more than authority." It worked, infuriatingly well, and within a week Varric had something he hadn't dared hope for in 4 years of mountain darkness. A pack. Untrained in formation, certainly, prone to enthusiastic chaos whenever the pups decided training drills were actually an elaborate game invented for their benefit, but bonded in a way deeper than any pack he'd commanded before. Woven together not through hierarchy and fear, but through years of Undine's quiet, patient love. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he preferred it considerably. "You're doing that thing again?" Undine said one afternoon, watching him watch the wolves practice flanking maneuvers that mostly devolved into an elaborate game of chase. "What thing?" "That thing where you look like you're about to cry over wolves." "I am not." "Bram, sit. Stay. Good. See? Even he doesn't believe you." The evenings belonged to the two of them, and to something neither had spoken aloud yet, but both felt building, unmistakable, and every glance held a beat too long, every brush of hands that lingered without explanation. "I missed this," Varric admitted one night, the fire burning low, her head resting against his shoulder. Bram sprawled across both their feet with the proprietary confidence of a wolf who considered the entire cabin, and frankly its occupants, his personal property. "Not just you, this, the quiet. Something that isn't a throne room or a cell. You'll have to give some of it up," Ondine said softly, "when we go back." "I know." His arms tightened around her. "I'm hoping we can keep some of it anyway. A cabin in the woods we visit. A king who occasionally remembers how to build a fire badly, just to keep you company in your incompetence." "My fire building has improved enormously, thank you." "It genuinely has not, and I love you for refusing to admit it." It was the first time either of them had said the word aloud since his return. Not because the feeling was new, but because 4 years apart had made it feel almost too large to risk out loud, as though speaking it might somehow undo the impossible fact of having him back at all. Ondine turned her face up to his, golden firelight catching in her eyes, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of them said anything else at all. Outside, the wolves settled into their nightly circle around the cabin, an entire pack standing quiet watch over something they understood, in whatever wordless way wolves understand things, was worth protecting. The peace shattered on the 9th day. Garrick arrived at a dead run, which for a man of his age and general opinion of exercise was alarming on its own merits, gasping out the news before he'd even fully reached the clearing. "They've got Marin," he managed, doubling over, hands braced on his knees. "Logan's men. Pulled her from her cottage 2 nights past. Word from the village is he's accusing her of treason, of feeding information to a fugitive. They're holding her at the Capitol under guard. Public sentencing in 5 days if the rumors going around the tavern are even half true." Ondine felt the blood drain from her face. He wouldn't execute an elder. The full council would never stand for it. "The council," Garrick said grimly, straightening with effort, "is exactly who he's making the example for. Word is he means to use her as a warning. Anyone who questions his rule meets the same fate. Anyone caught harboring the missing king meets considerably worse." Varric's expression had gone very still, very cold, the look of a man doing rapid, brutal math on what 5 days actually allowed for. "5 days isn't enough time to rally an army," he said quietly. "It is possibly enough time for something else entirely." "What?" Ondine asked, though some quiet part of her already feared she knew the answer. "We don't wait for him to come find us." Varric's jaw set, golden eyes hard with a resolve she hadn't seen in him since before the ambush had stolen 4 years from both their lives. "We bring this to his front door before he so much as lays another finger on her. Marin never gave him a single thing in 3 years of council meetings designed to break her. I'm not about to let him win now, when we finally have a way to stop him." That night, no one slept much. Ondine packed what little they could carry, her hands steadier than her heart had any right to be. Garrick sharpened tools that weren't weapons, because Varric had been firm, almost fierce on that single point. No blades, no bloodshed, not if there's any other way. We end this with truth, not with another body on that floor. And outside, beneath a sky just beginning to lose its stars, 19 wolves rose one by one and turned their faces west, toward the Capitol, toward a fight none of them had asked for, but every one of them, without exception, intended to finish. They reached the outskirts of the Capitol under cover of a moonless night, 19 wolves moving through the forest like a single-held breath. Varric and Ondine walking at the center of them in a silence too full of purpose to need words. The castle looked smaller than Ondine remembered. 4 years ago, it had loomed over her like judgment itself. Every tower a reminder of everything she'd lost in a single morning. Now, watching its torchlit windows from the tree line with Varric's hand wrapped tight around hers, she saw only stone and borrowed ambition dressed up in colors that had never truly belonged to the man wearing them. The sentencing's at dawn, In the main courtyard, Garrick whispered, returning from a scouting run looking thoroughly unimpressed with everyone he'd overheard along the way. Public. Logan wants witnesses. The whole capital, dragged out of their beds to watch him make his point. Then we'll give him witnesses, Varric murmured. To something else entirely. You say that with far too much confidence for a man who, 4 months ago, was losing arguments to a fox. I've grown since then. You really haven't. Bram, pressed close against Undine's leg, let out a low huff that sounded suspiciously like agreement, and for one strange, suspended moment, despite everything waiting for them at dawn, Undine found herself smiling. They moved into position before first light, the wolves fanning silently into the shadows lining the courtyard's outer wall, close enough to hear, close enough to act, far enough to wait. Dawn broke gray and cold over a crowd of townsfolk summoned from their beds to watch an elder pay for loyalty Logan had decided, in his desperation, to call treason. Marin stood at the center of it all, hands bound, chin lifted with the same stubborn dignity she'd worn through 4 years of council meetings designed to wear her down, refusing, even now, even here, with a crowd of frightened neighbors watching, to give him the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. Marin of the Western Hall, Logan announced, his voice pitched for effect, for the crowd, for a confidence Undine could see even from a distance didn't quite reach his eyes. Charged with treason against the crown, charged with aiding and harboring a fugitive against the stability of this territory, the sentence for such crimes is one I would very much like to hear you finish. Varric's voice cut clean across the courtyard. Before you explain to everyone gathered here exactly which crown you imagine yourself defending. Every head turned at once. Every breath in that courtyard seemed to catch and hold. He walked out from the shadow of the gate with Undine at his side, and 19 wolves flowing silent and golden-eyed behind them. And the sight of it moved through the crowd like water, finding a crack in old stone. The Alpha King, scarred and lean and unmistakably, impossibly alive, flanked by a bonded pack larger and stranger than any living soul in that courtyard had ever witnessed. Logan's composure cracked first in his eyes, then visibly in the white-knuckled grip he had on the podium before him. That's not possible. You're dead. You were confirmed dead, the Eastern Outpost reported. Confirmed by whom? Varric's voice carried, calm and merciless, the voice of a man who'd spent 4 years rehearsing this exact moment in a cell that smelled permanently of stone and wolfsbane. By the same council you bribed with private dinners and careful promises? Or by the Eastern Outpost you personally ordered to keep me alive and silent for 4 years, because killing a king inside these walls would have brought down a curse even your ambition couldn't outrun. A murmur tore through the crowd, sharp and disbelieving, rippling outward in waves. Marin's chin lifted further still, something fierce and triumphant finally breaking through 4 years of careful, exhausted patience. I have the letter, Varric continued, drawing the burned-edged scrap of parchment Garrick had recovered weeks ago from a guard who'd grown considerably less loyal once it became clear his king was dead and his future uncertain. The prisoner still breathes. Your orders, my lord. Your own hand. Your own seal, pressed into wax I'd recognize anywhere, having worn its twin on my own finger for years before you stole it. Shall I read aloud what you ordered in return, or would you prefer to spare yourself that particular humiliation in front of your witnesses? Logan's mouth opened. Nothing useful came out of it. Around him, the council members who had stood silent and complicit through 4 long years were already shifting, already drawing careful, visible distance between themselves and a man whose throne had just begun, irreversibly, to crumble beneath him. It was never about stability, Varric said, quieter now, and somehow that landed harder than any shout could have. Was it? It was never truly the territory you were protecting, all those nights you sat alone with wine you didn't taste, telling yourself ambition justifies itself once it succeeds. I built this. Logan's voice cracked at last. 4 years of carefully constructed composure splitting wide open in front of the entire capital. I held this territory together while you rotted in some hole you were too proud to die in quietly. While she... His eyes flicked, venomous, toward Undine, played house in the woods with wild dogs and called it grieving. They're not wild dogs, Undine said, stepping forward, and her voice, to her own quiet astonishment, did not shake at all. They're a pack, my pack, bonded freely, through years you spent scheming and I spent surviving the wreckage you left me with. I was cast out of my own home by a man I trusted like a brother stands to a brother, Logan. I built something real out of that wreckage. You built a throne out of lies, and lies don't hold weight forever. You should have known that before you started. The courtyard had gone utterly silent, hanging on whatever came next. It was Marin, still bound, still standing with her chin high despite everything, who finally broke it. "Cut these ropes," she said, to no one and everyone at once, her voice carrying with the unshaken authority of a woman who had earned every gray hair on her head. "And let the council that actually represents this territory decide what happens to him. Not Logan. Never Logan. He forfeited that right the moment he chose ambition over the boy who once called him brother." Guards who, moments before, had stood loyal to a stolen throne looked toward Varric, toward 19 wolves standing calm and unmistakably devoted at his back, toward a courtyard full of neighbors no longer willing to pretend they hadn't seen what they'd just seen, and made, one by one, the only choice that still made any sense. The ropes came away from Marin's wrists. She rubbed at the marks they'd left with quiet, deliberate dignity, shot Logan one final look that needed no words at all, and crossed the courtyard to stand, unbowed, at Varric's side. Logan, surrounded now by a courtyard that no longer answered to him, didn't run. There was, in truth, nowhere left to run to. He simply stood there at the podium that had never truly been his, the borrowed crown of his authority finally, completely gone, while the territory he'd stolen quietly, decisively, undeniably took itself back from him. Not with blades, not with blood, but with the truth he'd spent 4 years trying to outrun, finally allowed to stand in the open light of an ordinary vindicated dawn. The council chamber had been rebuilt by the time the formal coronation took place. Not in stone, which had never truly needed mending, but in something far harder to repair. Trust. It took the better part of a season, careful meeting after careful meeting, before the same hall where Undine had once stood, accused and abandoned, filled instead with a crowd that had come this time to watch something be restored rather than taken away. Logan was not among them. The council's judgment had come 3 weeks after that gray dawn in the courtyard, delivered by Marin herself in a voice that carried the particular weight of someone who had finally, fully earned the right to speak it. No blood was shed in that reckoning, and none would be. Varric had insisted on that point with a stubbornness that surprised even Undine, who knew exactly how much he'd had to forgive himself in order to manage it. "He doesn't deserve mercy," she told him quietly, the night before the sentencing, watching firelight flicker across his tired face. "No," Varric agreed. "But I don't want to become a man who decides what people deserve with a blade in his hand. I had 4 years in that cell to think about the kind of king I wanted to be if I ever got my crown back. That man wasn't him." So Logan was stripped of every title his birth and his betrayal had bought him, and sent beyond the territory's borders with nothing but the clothes on his back and a banishment that barred him from ever crossing them again. The decision split the council more than either of them expected. Several of the younger members argued for harsher terms, citing 4 years of suffering as proof that mercy had already been spent in full. It was Marin in the end who settled the matter. "Exile costs him everything he valued," she said simply. "His name, his comfort, his place among people who once respected him. There's no satisfaction in cruelty that a man like that would simply absorb and call martyrdom. Let him live with what he threw away instead. That's a longer sentence than any blade could manage." Undine thought sometimes about the boy Logan must have been once. The brother Varric had chosen long before either of them wore a crown. Before ambition hollowed something out of him that never grew back. She didn't forgive him. But standing in that rebuilt hall, she found she no longer needed to carry the weight of him either. He had made his choice. The territory had made its own in answer, and that finally was enough. Maren took a permanent seat at the head of the council, a position she accepted with the dry observation that someone competent had clearly needed to be in charge the whole time, and the added warning that she'd retire the moment either of them gave her a single reason to regret staying. She never got that reason. She did, however, get Garrick, who began appearing at the Capitol with suspicious regularity once he discovered the council kitchens kept a far better stocked larder than his own, and who Maren tolerated with an exasperation that fooled absolutely no one who'd ever watched the two of them argue cheerfully over chess for 3 straight hours, refusing, on principle, to let the other win. "You moved your bishop wrong," Maren told him at least once a week. "I did not." "You did. You always do. It's the only reason I still beat you. I'll have you know I was winning council debates before you learned to read. And yet here we are. Move your bishop back, old man." Pell, against every reasonable expectation, ended up captain of the Eastern Watch, a promotion Varric granted personally over the strenuous objections of several council members, on the grounds that any man capable of losing 11 copper coins he didn't have with that much consistent enthusiasm clearly possessed a rare talent for spotting trouble before trouble found him. Pell took the position with the same baffled, slightly suspicious gratitude he'd once shown every dice game he'd ever lost, and remained for the rest of his long career, deeply unconvinced he deserved it. He kept, framed above his desk, the original set of dice from that final losing game, a reminder he liked to tell new recruits that the worst night of his career had somehow also been the best. The pack, Bram, Hazel, the once reckless yearlings grown fully into themselves, the pups who were pups no longer, moved with Varric and Undine to the Capitol, and the sight of an Alpha King's throne room with 19 wolves denned comfortably across its floors became, within a year, simply how things were. Visiting dignitaries learned quickly not to make sudden movements near the throne. Scholars traveled from neighboring territories to study what they'd started calling the Hearth Bond, the first of its kind anyone could find record of. A pact bound not through blood, ritual, or shared shifting, but through years of patient, selfless tending, strong enough that the Luna who'd forged it could share its strength with the mate she chose to stand beside. It would, in time, reshape how bonds were understood across every territory that heard the story. But to Undine, it never stopped being simpler than that. She'd fed lonely, wild things until they trusted her. They'd given her a family in return. The magic, as far as she was concerned, had just been paying attention when no one else had bothered to. Bram took up permanent residence at the foot of the throne, much to the despair of the royal tailor, who complained bitterly and uselessly about wolf hair on ceremonial robes for years, without once succeeding in removing him from his chosen spot. Hazel, for her part, appointed herself unofficial supervisor of the royal kitchens, and no cook in that castle's history ever again dared leave a roast unattended. The coronation itself was small, by royal standards. Varric had insisted on that too. After 4 years of learning exactly how little pageantry actually mattered against the things that did. Vows were exchanged again, this time freely, this time witnessed not by a court performing loyalty it didn't feel, but by a territory that had watched its queen survive 7 years in the woods and come back stronger than the throne she'd been cast out of. Undine wore gray that day instead of royal blue. A quiet nod no one but Varric fully understood. And when he placed the crown back on her head with his own hands, his voice breaking slightly on the words, the whole hall erupted into something far warmer than ceremony, something that sounded, unmistakably, like relief. "I believe," Varric said afterward, watching the celebration spill out into the courtyard, Wolves and nobles and villagers mingling with an ease that would have seemed impossible a year before. That this is the part where I'm supposed to give a speech about strength and destiny. Please don't, Ondine said. You'll make Bram cry, and then I'll have to comfort him instead of celebrating. Wolves don't cry. Bram does. Don't tell him I told you. He laughed, a full, unguarded sound that still, even now, caught in her chest every time she heard it. A reminder of everything they'd both nearly lost and somehow, impossibly, gotten back. Epilogue. 7 years to the day after she'd knelt sobbing in the mud at the forest's edge, certain her life was over, Ondine stood in that same throne room watching a trembling young wolf named Sable kneel before a council that had finally, fully learned how to listen. Sable wasn't royalty. She was a girl from the western border, cast out by a clan that had decided her quiet nature made her unfit for the future they'd planned for her. She stood now exactly where Ondine once had, chin trembling, hands shaking at her sides, certain the world had already judged her unworthy. Ondine crossed the hall and knelt before her, gray eyes meeting frightened ones. I know exactly what this feels like, she said softly. I promise you, it does not end here. Behind her, Varric watched with their daughter balanced on one hip, a sturdy, golden-eyed girl of 2 who'd inherited her mother's stubbornness, and judging by her current determined attempt to climb toward Bram, her grandfather's complete disregard for personal safety. Marin offered the girl a candied plum to buy a few more minutes of peace. Garrick muttered something about the council finally developing decent taste in policy, for once in its long, frustrating history. Sable looked up at Ondine, and for the first time since arriving at the gates, something in her shoulders finally loosened. You really still feed wolves? She asked. Even now? Even as queen? Especially now. Ondine smiled, helping her to her feet. Come, I'll show you. It's the easiest thing in the world, once someone finally bothers to teach you how. They walked out together into the late afternoon light, queen and stranger, while behind them the territory that had once cast out a grieving girl carried on, finally, peacefully, exactly the way it always should have. Full, warm, and home. And that, listener, is how the story of Ondine and Varric ends. The story of an empty cabin that became a home, and of a love that no betrayal could ever extinguish. Tell me in the comments, which part of this journey moved you the most? The humiliation in the throne room, the unthinkable gesture by the fire, the discovery of the hearth bond, the reunion in the clearing, or that ending in the epilogue? And let me know if you want more stories like this, featuring moons, alpha kings, and bonds that fate tries to break but never can.